Good evening or good morning, wherever you are in the world. I'm Tan Xiaochin and I'm moderating the third YouTube session of the 9th International Women's Day edition of our Read for Pixels campaign. Through Read for Pixels, the Pixel Project is collaborating with 13 award-winning best-selling authors to raise awareness about violence against women and to raise funds for the Pixel Project to keep our efforts to end violence against women alive and kicking. We'll be telling you more about the Read for Pixels fundraiser, which has lots and lots of exclusive author goodies a little later in this session. You can find out more about the Pixel Project by visiting www.thepixelproject.net. Now, we have a very special guest for today's live Read for Pixels discussion and Q&A session, the lovely historical mystery author, Karen Odden. Hi, Karen. Welcome to Read for Pixels.
Hello. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Now, a bit of an intro for Karen, although I'm sure no one needs it. Now, Karen is a USA Today best-selling author who received her PhD in English from New York University, writing her dissertation on Victorian literature, and has taught at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee before writing fiction. Her award-winning mysteries are all set in 1870s London. Not surprising, as she loves family secrets and marginal voices, the smelly Thames, and the costermongers of 1870s London, medical puzzles and odd facts about poison. Anything Scotland Yard. The true weird stories that surround musicians and artists, and good old-fashioned romantic suspense. Her fifth book, Under a Veiled Moon, from her Inspector Corravan series, has been nominated for a Lefty Award and an Agatha Award. Now, aside from spending time with us here today, Karen has also generously donated some super exclusive goodies to the stash of author treats we have up as perks for donors at the Read for Pixels Rally Up fundraising page. They are Karen Odden's Very Victorian Tea and Mystery Bundle, which has already been snapped up thanks to our generous donor, Janice Yates. Now, Janice will receive a unique goodie bundle personally assembled by Karen, which includes one set of 2 signed and personalized Victorian mystery paperbacks, one set of 2 signed and personalized Inspector Corravan hardcovers, 1 bookmark, and 1 box of 50 sachets of Victorian London fog tea, which is a wonderfully fragrant blend of black tea, bergamot, lavender, and vanilla flavors, perfect for warming up on cold winter days while you read. But these next 2 bundles are still available. And one is the Karen Odden Critique and Coaching Bundle. Karen is offering a chance for one Read for Pixels donor anywhere in the world to have their work in progress in the English language only critiqued by her. This opportunity includes 1 written critique of the first 20 pages of a manuscript and 1 post-critique 30-minute Skype call. There is only one of this opportunity available, and this is a rare chance for a budding historical fiction or historical mystery author to get expert guidance from one of today's finest historical mystery authors, who is both an expert with a PhD in English as well as a professional editor in her own right. The next bundle is the Victorian Mayhem, Murder and Mystery Book Club session. Karen is offering one unique online event for one book club that donates to the Pixel Project. The virtual book club visit will include one 20-minute slideshow of Victorian images, including Victorian streets, policemen in uniform, scandalous headlines in the newspapers, and so on. And one 40-minute discussion and Q&A session about one of the following books by Karen, either A Trace of Deceit, Down a Dark River, or Under a Veiled Moon. Whether your book club has already read Karen's books or is filled with history buffs, this is the perfect treat for all of you, with your donation going towards supporting the cause to end violence against women and girls. We are currently at $880 out of our $5,000 goal, which is a bit slower than we would like at this stage of our fundraiser. So please do give generously before the fundraiser ends on April 15 next month. All funds go towards the Pixel Project's work to help end violence against women. And if you're watching this session on YouTube right now, you will also be able to ask Karen questions live. Just make sure you're logged into your YouTube account so that you can type your questions into the chat box to the right of the YouTube screen. And Anusha, who is today's producer and chat box moderator, will relay them to me to read out to Karen to answer. And now, over to Karen. What will you be reading for us today?
I'm going to be reading a section from Down a Dark River, which is the first of the Inspector Corravan books. And, sorry. And in
Now,
this section, I'll tell you a little bit about it before I read it so that you can kind of get a little bit of context.
okay, so I'm going to give you the floor, so please do go ahead.
Okay. So in this book, Inspector Corravain, who's an inspector at Scotland Yard, is faced with a series of deaths. These beautiful young women placed in boats, murdered, sent down the Thames River. And he has been basically banging his head against a wall, and he can't figure out what is going on. But here in this section, he interviews a young woman named Rachel. And Rachel is one of the women in this story who provide him with a very important piece of information. For the third time, I asked, "What happened?" Her gaze was full of accusation. "Why would you believe me?" "Do you see this?" I pointed to the small scab that remained on my cheek and pushed my hair back from my forehead to reveal the bare patch. When I tried to take Madeline home, thinking that's where she'd want to go, she fought me so hard she pulled my hair and drew blood, struck at me with my own truncheon. She would have killed me before she went back inside. So I'll believe anything you tell me about what happened in that house. At last, Rachel spoke, her voice low. "He come at me." "Stephen Beckford?" She hesitated. "The first time it was his brother, Robert. He come at me with a knife in the kitchen." I knew better than to pull out my pocketbook and pencil, but I had to remember every single word of this. She wasn't going to say it again. He'd grab me mean-like and kiss me and touch me, and then he'd give me a pound and laugh afterward. Her lips trembled. I tried to be careful so I weren't ever alone, and mostly I could, but he'd catch me coming or going sometimes, or if it was late and no one was about. And he did more each time. How many times? 4. Her expression was at once pained and pleading. "You probably think I'm no better than a common whore, but it weren't like that. My parents are dead. I didn't have anywhere else to go." "I don't think you're a whore," I said tightly. "I think he's a bloody savage." She started at the venom in my voice. "Go on," I said. "What happened the last night you were there? What did he do?" "Not just him, both of them, Mr. Beckford and his brother." She swallowed. "Close your eyes." "What?" The word slipped out. "Close your eyes," she repeated, her voice breaking. "I can't have you looking at me when I tell you this." I'd never been asked that before, but I understood. There had been times in my life when I'd wanted the same. All right. I shut my eyes and put my palm across for good measure. My hand smelled faintly of Stiles's onion poultice. "I won't look until you say you're finished." "Oh, you'll know," she said. Every nerve of mine was strained toward her to catch every word and nuance of tone. She began haltingly. "That day, the chimney, the one in the library, I mean, it had been smoking, and we'd had a sweep in to clear it out. It took him hours, so I didn't get to clean that room until after dinner. It must have been near 10 o'clock. When I finished, I came into the kitchen to eat. The supper cook left, and Mr. Beckford and his brother came in and found me at the table. I'd stupidly lit a lamp." Her voice thickened with anguish. "They were real quiet like, but I could smell the drink on their breath." She told me then the things they did to her, things so vile that waves of heat and ice ran from the top of my head down every nerve. My heart thudded sickeningly inside my chest, and I longed for the end. But I'd asked after all. So I clamped my teeth on the inside of my left cheek until at last it was over. I took away my hand to find her eyes full of fear that I'd doubt her. "I believe you," I said hoarsely. "I believe every bloody word, Rachel." Her lips parted and tears sprang to her eyes. She dashed them away with her fingertips. "Did Madeline, Mrs. Beckford, did she know about this?" I asked. Rachel sniffed. "That's why they stopped. She came down to the kitchen. She must have heard something or knew somehow. She opened the door and saw everything and screamed." I could imagine it. Rachel atop the kitchen table, the men on her, and Madeline at the doorway, her mouth open wide. "What happened next?" I asked. Rachel exhaled so deeply I smelled the ale on her breath. "Mr. Beckford, Stephen, I mean, he let go of me and went toward her, but she took one of them big knives from the wood block by the sink and kept him away. She told them to let me go or she'd kill them, and she might not be big, but she looked scary then, like a witch, her eyes flashing and her hand waving the knife, screeching to raise the dead. It weren't enough to scare him after that first startle, but they let me go, and I got myself over to her. She told me to run, so I collected my things from my room and took off out the back." Her words silenced me. But at last, I understood the depth of Madeline's terror at the thought of going back to that house. Her husband was a monster. And what would he have done to her, knowing she'd witnessed his crime? Rachel added, I've thought about it over and over since then, and I think she suspected, don't you? Else, why would she come looking for me? Why, indeed, unless it had happened before. I made my voice very quiet. Rachel, did Madeline know anyone named Elaine? Her eyes were incredulous. Hurriedly, I added, one day, Madeline muttered something about a lane, and we thought she meant a street. Only later did I realize it could be Elaine. And when you said just now that Madeline suspected, she shook her head in bewilderment. How could you not know? You're police. We have hundreds of cases, and if it wasn't one of mine, I wouldn't have heard. I leaned forward. What's her surname? Price, she said. Her name was Elaine Price. Was, I repeated, and she nodded unhappily. Who was she? The other kitchen maid, sides Harriet. 'Twas last summer, ages before his brother, and him started on me. Only she accused him. She took a breath. See what it got her. Suddenly I remembered Stephen Beckford had listed Ellie Price among the servants who'd left. What did she get? I asked. Nothing, of course. Her voice was disdainful. She went to trial, though she shouldn't have bothered. We all said so. Beckford had the doctor and all the rest on his side. The judge gave her £2.10 and sent her away. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My breath quickened as my mind began to arrange the pieces, working them all in. The judge, Albert, a doctor, Forsyth, Elaine, the Lady of Shalott, the river, the boats, the rope, the torn, bloody skirts, the red stone, Robert's ring. In that moment, I felt the case change course as surely as I ever felt the tide turn under my oar. Tell me more about Elaine Price, I said. What happened to her after the trial? She looked askance. If I tell you, you won't tell him, will you? He'd just laugh. I promise. With a sigh, she ran her thumb along a ridge in the glass. Elaine knew she wouldn't find another place to work, not here in London. Anyway, with Beckford saying she was trouble. Besides, she'd start showing soon. She was with child? I asked sharply. You're certain? She nodded. She told Harriet. They stayed friends even after she'd gone. Elaine's monthlies had stopped and she was sick every morning, only the baby came too early and it died. Near 6 or 7 weeks ago, not long before I left. Elaine kept bleeding after it came, and she died too. She rested her elbow on the table and fidgeted with her hair. In doing so, her sleeve slipped off her wrist, revealing scars from the ropes one of the Beckford brothers had used. I found myself staring at the skin, thin and red and puckered. She caught me looking and pulled her sleeve down. Sometimes I think maybe Elaine's the lucky one, she muttered, averting her eyes. At least she don't remember anything. I leaned back in my chair and blew out a sigh at the wickedness of it all. Rachel, you need to make a formal report or it'll happen again, if not to Harriet, to someone else. Her eyes widened and panic came over her face. It would be different this time, I began. She leaned over the table, her hands wrapped tightly around the edges. I told you because I thought it would help Mrs. Beckford. But I'd hang myself before I speak of it to a group of men who'd laugh at me or worse. And just when I've settled into a new place, no, I won't do it. I won't. Her voice had risen to a shrill pitch. People were staring. I muttered, all right, Rachel, I won't make you. Swear it. I swear, I replied, my voice as vehement as hers. The room had gone silent. We sat quietly until all the stares drifted away, and I added softly, I will never make you speak of it again, anywhere or at any time. A sheen of sweat had appeared on her beautiful face. Tears filled her eyes again and ran down her cheeks. I thought you understood. I do. I dug in my pocket for a handkerchief, relieved that I'd put a fresh one in the night before. She looked at the folded square uncertainly. It's clean, I said. She took it, opened it to its full size, and pressed it to her eyes. At last she took it away. I mean it, she said slowly and distinctly. I will take my life rather than repeat that story in court just to be laughed at. Again, I believed her. Every bloody word.
Thank you, Karen. This is definitely one of the most affecting scenes in that book for me. So I'm really glad that you shared it.
Thank you.
Yeah. So let's hop into the questions. Your first three novels feature intrepid, resourceful, and complex female characters such as Elizabeth Fraser in The Lady in the Smoke, Nell Hallam in The Dangerous Duet, and Annabel Rowe in A Trace of Deceit. And of course, you have very powerful supporting female characters as well in your Inspector Corrivan series. Now, who or what are your inspirations for your female characters?
Well, for the first 3 books, I actually leaned pretty heavily on real Victorian women, not Victorian women that I had read about in all the Victorian novels I read in grad school, but real Victorian women. For example, in Dangerous Duet, this book is about a young woman who is a very talented pianist, but she needs to earn money for tuition to go to the Royal Academy. And this is actually based on Fanny Dickens, who is Charles's older sister. So in the 1820s, she was a brilliant pianist. She was studying with one of Beethoven's proteges at the Royal Academy, like that kind of brilliant. And but in the 1820s, there really weren't a lot of opportunities for women to make money. And the Dickens family was sort of notoriously in and out of debt, and the family was in the poorhouse and this kind of thing. And so eventually Fanny had to quit. She didn't have the money for tuition, and she died young. She stopped her music and died young. And I just felt like this was the most heart-wrenching story. This is terrible. But what's interesting is that with the rise of the music halls in the 1850s, there were about 250 of them in London. There were women performers. Now, they got paid less than the men, about half of what the men got paid, but every single one of the music halls pretty much had a piano player who would play the interlude music, for example, between the magician and then the dog trainers and then the trapeze artists and all these different acts they had going on. And so I decided, rather than have Nell be put in Fanny Dickens' position, she was going to dress up as a man and go to a music hall and get a job. And she does. Yes. So I, this was possible. And obviously, this is fiction, but there were hundreds and hundreds of women performers in these music halls. That is true. That is all true. They were trapeze artists. They were magicians' assistants. They were singers, dancers, violinists. So it's based on what Victorian women really were allowed to do at the time. And then in A Trace of Deceit, the inspiration was my work at Christie's auction house in the 90s in New York. That's how I got interested in the art and auction world. But what's absolutely fascinating, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about one of my heroes from the Victorian period. His name is Felix Slade. He was an entrepreneur. He believed profoundly in equality for men and women. And he said, I'm going to start a chair for fine arts at Oxford, Cambridge, and University College London. So in 1871, he opened up the Slade School of Art in London. And he said that the women are going to come in on the same footing as the men. And he gave away 4 scholarships each year, 2 to women and 2 to men. And it was the first place that women could study art seriously, because up until that point, the thought was that they couldn't participate fully because they would have to be sketching the nude marble statues for their anatomy classes. And he said, yeah, we're going to let them in and they're going to sketch sketches. And, so they actually had a curtain dividing the room, but the instructor went back and forth between the 2 rooms. So the women were getting equal instruction. And some of the women, like Kate Greenaway, was in one of the early classes. They still give away the Greenaway Medal for the best children's book illustrations in Britain. But she was an early Slade student. Yeah.
Oh, lovely.
So again, real people, I mean, they were outliers. There weren't a lot of women doing this, but there were women doing this.
Awesome. This kind of ties in nicely to the next question. And I mean, as you know, historical fiction of all types has their fair share of female stereotypes and tropes. Plus, writing historical novels comes with certain constraints in terms of staying true to the norms of the period. Yes. So how do you challenge stereotypes and subvert tropes to create female characters with complexity and agency when dealing with the world around them, including situations that involve sexism, misogyny, and violence against women and girls, while also staying true to the Victorian time period of your novels?
This is a great question, and I really appreciate when people ask about the real constraints of Victorian England. One of the tough things about Victorian England actually is that it was so long. I mean, Queen Victoria got on the throne in 1837 and didn't get off until 1901. That's 64 years. And making generalizations about the period would be like us making generalizations about our world that would ostensibly hold true from 1959 until today, which we couldn't do. I mean, you know, we've changed, everything has changed because of the internet. And for the Victorians, everything changed largely because of the railways and the telegraph. So you can't make generalizations about the Victorian period. So I always kind of caution people about that because, for example, up until 1870, it is completely true that legally women were subjected to the legal doctrine of coverture. And what this means is their legal identity, a married woman's legal identity, was literally covered by that of her husband. So anything that she brought to the marriage, he owned. Her children were his. She could not initiate a lawsuit without his approval. I mean, her legal identity vanished underneath his. But in 1870, partly as a result of a lot of newspaper and agitation and changes in laws and things like this, in 1870 there was this new law passed called the Married Women's Property Act. And in it, one of the provisions was that a woman who worked, for example, in a shop or in a mill, and who earned her own wage was legally entitled to keep it. And that's a significant thing. That's a significant little wedge into coverture, because it gives women all of a sudden the option of, she now in practice she may have turned it over to her husband for household expenses or whatever, but legally it was hers. And these kind of incremental changes mattered. And so when I'm writing, part of the reason I write in 1870s London is because things like the Married Women's Property Act, the Education Act of 1870, which put all children, boys and girls, in school until 12, the opening of the Slade School, the opening of certain publishing doors to women, the opening of the medical schools. I mean, I think there were 6 or 8 women in Edinburgh at the medical school at this time. I mean, the 1870s are seeing shifts. And I think that's really interesting as part of the setting for my books.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that sounds really interesting. And okay, let's pivot a little, right? So among the relationships your books depict are female friendships and family relationships that have a camaraderie and complexity that would feel very real to many female readers. Why do you think many authors, including mystery crime authors, still have trouble writing stories that pass the Bechdel test, despite the fact that there are many more things that women talk about other than men?
The Bechdel test, if I remember correctly, is women talking to women about something other than men.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes. Yes. In any media. Yeah.
Yes. And I think it's a really interesting question. And one of the things that I wonder about, and I don't have an answer for this. I think it's a really complicated question. I'm sure that everyone has thoughts about this. But I think that one of the things that I've noticed in historical fiction is sometimes there's a rather strong reliance on the romance plot to keep things going. And I think oftentimes that kind of sidelines it. But what I really appreciate is when I can sit down and get to know some of my women characters. I'm especially interested in mothers and daughters. And I feel as though, like, for example, in Down a Dark River, Ma Doyle adopts Michael Corravain. Michael Corravan's mother vanishes when he is 11, not because she doesn't love him, but because she's taken and she has to go away. And so Michael is a orphan on the streets. He becomes a thief. He's a bare knuckles boxer. He works on the docks. And he is adopted by Ma Doyle because he basically saves the life of her son.
Yeah.
And Pat brings him home. And one of the things that is really instructive for Michael is watching Ma Doyle interact with both Pat and Colin, the boys, and Elsie. her
Mm.
daughter, because she is very conscious of wanting to make sure that Elsie is canny, aware, educated, capable of managing the shop. I mean, he's very aware of their relationship. And in fact, at the very, very end of Down a Dark River, as he and the villain are standing on the bridge, Ma Doyle's voice is the one he hears in his head. And a lot of that has to do with the conversations he's listened to between Ma and Elsie. So I like having women in conversation. It's interesting that I don't, a lot of times my women characters don't necessarily have a lot of close friends, because that's kind of not what I'm exploring in these books, but they definitely have relationships with mothers and sisters. It's the family unit that I'm kind of interested in.
Yes. We are going to hop into talking to the men in your books after this, but I just want to put in a quick comment for those who are listening out there that speaking of mother and daughter relationships, I think The Lady in the Smoke and The Dangerous Duet, the relationships between Elizabeth Fraser and Nell Hallam and their respective mothers, maybe not an obvious direct relationship in a way, but it's quite it definitely feeds into the character development of both of them.
Oh,
So
very much.
Interesting aspect. So go and read those books, people. So, okay, now hopping over to the men. So your main male characters like Scotland Yard inspectors, Michael Corravan in the Inspector Corravan series, Matthew Hallam from The Dangerous Duet, and Sergeant Paul Wilcox from The London in the Smoke, all respect the women in their lives and treat them as equals. Now, this is not always true of the mystery crime genre, which seems to be rife with macho stereotypes, including misogynistic, hard-drinking private eyes and male killers who specifically target female victims.
Yes.
Do you think reframing how stories describe men and boys away from hostile and toxic stereotypes and towards complexity and even vulnerability can be one of the ways crime mystery writers can break away from the harmful tropes that promote toxic masculinity and the dehumanization of women?
Oh, absolutely. And it's very funny that, because I guess one of the things as an author is, I see my books as individual, and then you kind of put them all together in an arc, and I think, oh yeah, I'm doing the same thing in all of these books. And I mean, you're exactly right that the relationships between the women and the love interests, as it were, they are founded upon respect and decency and a sense of honesty and fairness. And I think that that's part of what the cultural work of a novel can do. It can propose that and show it without sort of hitting you over the head with it, but to watch their interaction. And also, I think the important thing is not that the two of them come together like this, but that they slowly approach each other, and they have to negotiate little bits and little pieces, but each one is giving something and each one is taking something, and there's a kind of a quality that emerges, not just between the characters, but also in the book. Like when you watch the dialogue, you see that they're getting equal time. You know what I'm saying? And it was funny because I didn't recognize that I had done this I think it was in A Trace of Deceit, until one of my beta readers pointed out that, you have a dialogue going and she is actually speaking more than he is. Not a lot more, but a little bit more. And there's one scene where Annabelle and Matthew Hallam are looking at a painting. And she is a painter at the Slade, and her older brother is a forger who got into all kinds of trouble. He's an opium addict, and he was in jail and all this kind of thing. Anyway, and he ends up being murdered, and just to find out why. But they're standing in front of a painting, and she explains the painting to him. She explains what to look at and what the lines of sight are and the kind of story and just even like, well, what does that globe in the corner mean? And what does this little patch over here mean? And he's listening. Now, later on, he teaches her something from his perspective as a policeman, but there's a give and take there that I like to put in my books. And quite frankly, in Down a Dark River, Belinda is the EQ. Like
Yeah.
Corrivan's, I mean, somebody said he's a little bit of a meathead sometimes, and he kind of is, he needs her to point certain things out and show him also the importance of, I mean, her point to him is, you came out of Whitechapel, you're great with your fists, you're good with your knife, you're very decisive and strong and all those things, and you're a rescuer, you rescued Pat Doyle, and you rescue people in your job and stuff. But do you realize that you get something out of being a rescuer? You don't ever have to be vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And, he kind of poo-poos it, and then later on he recognizes, oh, she's so right. Like he gets it, he sees it, and we as readers can see it, and we are with her, at that moment in Down a Dark River. I mean, these moments with women are pivotal to his growth and his discovery of himself and the clues of the mystery. Like it all depends on women, but Belinda gives him that peace that he needs.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Belinda is definitely a very fascinating character in her own right, and I hope we discover more of her, as the series goes on. But also, yes, coming back to the Michael Corravan and his realization. Do you think that reframing this depiction of men is more difficult and complex to achieve in historical fiction like yours, which is set during the Victorian era when patriarchal norms were still largely unchallenged and women's movements were just starting to gain momentum?
That's a great point. I think that part of what this depends upon is having a male character who is not part of the traditional patriarchy. I mean, Michael Corravan is born and raised in Whitechapel, which if you've heard of Whitechapel, it's because Jack the Ripper murders happened there. I mean, he's a street rat. He is poor. He is a thief. He works his butt off at the docks trying to earn enough money to help Ma Doyle pay the bills. He is by virtue of his class, he is disenfranchised the same way a woman by virtue of her gender is disempowered. So so he doesn't quite fit, sort of the patriarchy either. And in addition to the fact that he's Irish, which in 1870s London is a serious problem. I mean, there was a tremendous amount of discrimination against the Irish, from like no Irish need apply on the advertisements for jobs to burning down their churches and their pubs and things like that. Yeah.
Okay. Let's talk about genre. Because books and stories in the mystery crime genre usually involve some kind of violence, including violence against women. Now, how do you think mystery crime authors can tackle the issue of violence against women without falling back on harmful stereotypes and tropes?
This is again another really good question. You are very good at this. So, I think that there are a couple of things. First of all, my book begins, Down a Dark River begins with a woman named Madeline Beckford, who Corravan has been searching for weeks because her husband says, oh, she's missing. And he finally finds her, and she's in an asylum, and one of the really bad asylums, and she is mute, and he rescues her out of the asylum, and he puts her in a carriage, and he takes her home because he thinks, oh, she's going to want to go home and be safe with her nice warm fire and her beautiful house in Mayfair. And they pull onto the street, and she turns around and she basically grabs his truncheon and starts wailing him with it. I mean, she's tiny. She's been starved for like 5 weeks, and she is so afraid and so furious that she whirls and hits him and pulls his hair, and he's like, okay, never mind, we're not going here, and he drives off to the hospital. And he tucks her in with his friend who runs a hospital, and he's a safe place. And what happens is that the reason that the whole idea of that section is to show how profoundly violence or trauma upon women affects them. And she goes mute, and then she ends up, the only way she can speak is in French in her dreams. And so I'm trying to tackle here the relationship between violence and women's speech, their voice, and where they get their power and how important that anger is, because I mean, that anger, it does something. It accomplishes something. It tells Corravan, okay, I'm not taking you home. I'm getting you out of here to someplace safe where I know you're going to be taken care of and fed and nurtured until you are ready to speak. And even in that passage that I read, today about Rachel, again, it is, her words silence him. He's listening, and women's voices are important in this book. But also it's very clear that violence can suppress the voice. But what I love about Madeline Beckford's character is that as suppressed and as violated as she is, she still finds a way to be heard, whether it's through her actions or through her, speaking French in the middle of the night when she's asleep or whatever it is. There's an indomitable quality to all of the women in this book. Ma Doyle, who, runs a shop in Whitechapel in a really sketchy part of town and makes it work. And even Belinda, who is a novelist in a time when there were some women novelists, but not a ton of them. And she makes her money by her pen. And so there's this kind of resilience that I think that we can show, and we can also, basically condemn the people, the characters, sort of at the level of plot, the characters who are being violent to women. And the Beckfords, they get their punishment by the end.
Okay, and this next question is kind of tangentially related. So your books aren't generally overtly violent, but there is still a certain amount of violence that has to be described, given that torture, murder, and sexual violence have been parts of your various plots. How do you find a balance between showing violence as an integral part of the story and not showing violence gratuitously?
It's a delicate balance, to be sure, because I want the violence to be taken seriously. I don't ever want it to feel like it's being glossed over or dismissed as, oh, that's just what happens. But so, for example, in Down a Dark River, Rachel tells him, close your eyes. But what actually happens to her is elided, and all we get is Corravan's very visceral, horrified response to it. The icy feeling down his veins and everything. And so I think it's this delicate balance between being careful to represent it as much as you need to demonstrate to the reader how serious it is. But then, and that's where you stop, as opposed to going into the gory details. That doesn't add anything. What you just want is that sense of seriousness around it and the weight of it and making it real, because these things did happen. But then that's where you stop. Does that make sense?
Totally, and this ties in beautifully to the next question, which is, in 2018, the Staunch Prize, an award set up to recognize crime and thriller novels without violence against women, was launched, and faced criticism from major crime novelists like Val McDermid, who believe that as long as there is violence against women in the world, it should be reflected in fiction. So what is your take on the idea that mystery, crime, thriller books can work without some form of violence against women? Do you think it's feasible given some of the long-standing genre conventions and tropes?
I think it depends on what the story demands. Under a Veiled Moon, there is no violence against women per se. I mean, there's a steamship disaster where 600 and some people drown, and some of them are women, and some of them are children, and some of them are men. It's not a gendered thing. It's just it's just everybody sort of all in the Thames together. But there's no violence against women, because that wasn't the sort of book. That wasn't the crime that I was investigating. The crime that I was investigating really was this steamship disaster, and how the very next morning the newspapers start broadcasting that the Irish caused it. That is a different kind of crime. That is a crime of knowledge and of discrimination and information. And part of what I was getting at in Under a Veiled Moon was about the violence that our culture can do to itself through media storms. retweeting, this kind of like irresponsible reporting, and the way that it shreds, with the way that it can shred communities. So I was looking at a different kind of violence in that book, but there's, I mean, aside from the drownings, which aren't really directed to women, but there aren't any. I mean, the only person who's murdered, well, there are two men who are murdered, but there's nothing that happens to women in that book. So I think that there could certainly be, strong stories that don't have anything to do with violence against women.
Okay, fair enough. Speaking of stories, so stories can be one of the most powerful ways of bringing about social change because they can help to change cultural narratives and perspectives about social issues and traditions. Do you think that writers who write historical fiction have a responsibility to address the themes of sexism, misogyny, and violence against women in their stories, since history is rarely kind to women and gender-based violence can take very specific forms depending on the historical period the author chooses?
I do believe that we have a certain responsibility to explore history repeats itself. When someone said to me something about, well, the Victorians didn't have social media, I said, well, they had 1,000 newspapers in London, and a lot of them were picking up each other's headlines and republishing them. So isn't that a retweet? I mean, and so I think, but I also believe that historical fiction has a very wonderful opportunity, and that is, there's a quote by the 13th century Persian poet Rumi. It says, it's something like, between the area of rightness and wrongness, there is a field. I will meet you there.
Okay.
And I like thinking about that field. And I think that with historical fiction, when the world within the book and the world from which the book is being read are far enough apart, it creates a field. It creates an imaginative space where symbolically some of these things like sexism and racism and cruelty and failures of compassion, these things can be examined without what Jill Lepore recently called the leaden passions of the present. We can set them aside a little bit and think, okay, well, we're talking about Victorians here, so let's talk about the Victorians and how how the Irish, for example, were treated on the docks, where they couldn't get long-term work. They had to get day work. And if there were heavy parcels to be lifted and there weren't any carts, the Irish put it on their backs. I mean, but it's a way also of opening up, a discussion about how some of these things are still happening in the world today. I think it just gives a little bit more space for it, I think.
So looking at it at a bit of a remove, but hoping that people will be able, they'll be able to pick it up and see like, hey, wait a minute, this seems pretty familiar.
Yeah. And readers are smart, especially historical fiction readers. They are all smart. they all read and they know a lot. Yeah. So.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. Oh, I think we have a question from the audience, so I'm going to put it up here. So this is from Misty306. Hi, Misty. So Misty is one of our regulars, so we can always rely on her for questions. So Misty is asking, historical fiction still loves to produce stories about World War II. Which era from the 20th century will or should produce the next abundance of stories?
This is a great question. I will never write books on the 20th century myself because it's not my area of expertise. I did my PhD in Victorian literature, and so I am just stuck there and sort of nailed there. But I think that a lot of books have been written about World War II. There's a sort of a flood of them on the market, and some really fantastic books. But I wonder if we could maybe take it back a little bit and go to, for example, the turn of the century when the New Woman was coming into being in England. This idea of, and the woman who is wearing pants for the first time, and beginning to advocate, because the women for example, in England, as far as England, the women in England didn't get the vote until between the wars. It was after World War I and before World War II. And I'd like to look at that period of, like, how did that happen? How did World War I, and the fact that you had so many men gone, how did that reshape England, and what opportunities did it create for women, and that kind of thing? I'd be curious about that.
Yeah. So Regina Yao, our founder and president, says the fin de siècle. Okay, I have no idea how to pronounce that era.
Fin de siècle. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, we are coming down to our last couple of questions. So we're going to pivot away from you as an author to you as a parent. So parents are usually the most influential role models in a person's life. As a mom, what do you think parents can do to help prevent violence against women and girls in future generations, and to get boys involved in helping to do so?
This is a great question. I actually have, I was lucky, I guess. I have a daughter. She is now 22 and a computer science major, and just finishing up her master's, actually. And I have a son who is 18. And I think one of the things that is lovely, is having children who are so very different, not just by virtue of their gender, but by virtue of their interests and their strengths and their sensitivities and this kind of thing. But and my children are very different, and they're 4 years apart. And so but as a parent, I think one of the things I really emphasized for both of them was that when there were issues or conflicts or things like that, that we sat down and we paid attention to it, and I said, you need to use your I feel language. I feel upset because, and both of them needed to have room to say it, and then the other person would have to be able to say, I heard this. Is that what you meant? And this is a really, I think, important way to make sure that the girls are speaking up and saying what they really mean and being heard. And the boys are saying what they really mean and they're being heard, and that they recognize that it's a two-way street. And they both needed to acknowledge the other person's point of view, or whatever the feeling was, even if they didn't agree with it. But they had to say, I see where you're coming from. And that creates, I think, in some ways, like a very nice emotional meeting spot and a boundary, because they can acknowledge, you may feel differently about this, but I still have a right to my feelings. It's like that. It's like there's a table and each one of them gets half. And so, and I noticed that, my daughter is in a very healthy relationship with her boyfriend, and they talk a lot. And she can bring things up like, hey, when you said this, it kind of sounded like that. Is this what you meant? There's this kind of checking in and okay, now we need to talk about this. And Kyle, for his part, my son, he is very affectionate and very forthright, and shares things, and reflects on things in ways that I really appreciate. So I don't know. God, we all make mistakes parenting. I'm sure I've made lots of them. But I do feel like that both of them know how to bring up their feelings and talk to each other. And I think that helps.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a great tip for, young parents out there. Okay. And so to our final question, this is a two-part question. So you have been so very incredibly supportive of our Read for Pixels campaign and our anti-violence against women work as a whole. So the first part, and this may seem a bit obvious, why do you support the cause to end violence against women?
Yeah, I mean, I think that anyone with any kind of compassion or understanding for, or love for our fellow and sister human beings
Mm-hmm.
is against violence toward anyone.
Mm.
And, you know, I am so sorry sometimes when I see in this world that people aren't using their words. They're using their
Mm.
fists, and they're using guns, and they're using, you know, people, you know, being just terribly cruel to each other. And it's
Mm.
heartbreaking. You know,
Mm.
I just, if there's anything at all that I can do to end these cycles of
Mm.
violence, you know, I mean, frankly, you know, particularly toward women, I think just simply because I am a woman.
Mm-hmm.
And while, you know, I have experienced, you know, I've experienced more discrimination than I have violence, but
Mm-hmm.
it is still something that just sort of sours your heart, you know,
Yeah.
and is deeply disconcerting. So you know, anything that I can do
Mm.
to support women and to prevent violence, I would be happy
Mm.
to do it.
Mm.
I really
Mm.
appreciate you having this program, because I think that this is near and dear to a lot of women's hearts.
Yes, and we really appreciate you hopping on board. Not only hopping on board, but also, providing the goodies to help
Mhm.
with our fundraising. But so the second part here, what do you think authors can do to help with the cultural change needed to eradicate violence against women and girls?
Well, I think we can. There are several things. We
Mm-hmm.
can certainly use our platform to speak up about it,
Mm-hmm.
and to, you know, to participate in programs such as these. And in our writings, I think that we can thematically and thematically by
Mm-hmm.
introducing women who are strong characters in our books, but also at the level of form. Um, by
Mm-hmm.
that I mean, even if I am writing a book that is ostensibly about an inspector at Scotland Yard, the
Mm-hmm.
strongest characters in the book and the ones who help him most are all women speaking. They are
Mm-hmm.
all women who are either acting or speaking or confronting him with the truth that he needs to hear. And so I think that there are a lot of different ways that at the level of symbol and theme and plot and structure of books, that we can show women, um, you know, being true to their voice, speaking
Mm-hmm.
their truth, and confronting at, you know, at a very sort of deep level, things like patriarchy and suppression of their voices, and disempowerment and disenfranchisement and all of these things. So I think that that's what novels can, that's the kind of work, that cultural work that novels can
Mm-hmm.
do.
Okay. And on that excellent note, thank you so much, Karen, for that
Thank you.
lovely and informative session. And in case you missed the start of our session today, we're excited to let you know that Karen has not only generously spent her time here with us today, but also donated a few super exclusive goodies to the stash of author goodies we have up as perks for donors at the Read for Pixels Rally Up fundraising page. They are Karen Odden's Very Victorian Tea and Mystery Bundle, which will be going to Janice Yates thanks to her kind donation. Her critique and coaching bundle, where Karen is offering a chance for one Read for Pixels donor anywhere in the world to have their work in progress in the English language only critiqued by her. The opportunity includes one written critique of the first 20 pages of a manuscript and one post critique 30-minute Skype call. There is only one of this opportunity available, and this is a rare chance for a budding historical fiction or historical mystery author to get expert guidance from someone who is not only one of today's finest historical mystery authors, but also an expert with a PhD in English and a professional editor in her own right. And there is also the Victorian Mayhem Murder and Mystery Book Club session, where Karen is offering one unique online event for one book club that donates to the Pixel Project. The virtual book club visit will include one 20-minute slideshow of Victorian images, including Victorian streets, policemen in uniform, scandalous headlines in newspapers, and so on. And also one 40-minute discussion and Q&A session about one of the following books by Karen. So it's either A Trace of Deceit, Down a Dark River, or Under a Veiled Moon. Whether your book club has already read Karen's books or is filled with history buffs, this is the perfect treat for all of you, with your donation going towards supporting the cause to end violence against women and girls. There are also plenty more goodies available from authors and publishers such as Sonali Dev, Chloe Lees, Angela Yuriko Smith, Adiba Jagidar, Carol Goodman, Liana Renee Haber, Romina Garber, and Tangle Publishing, and more. New goodies will be released every week throughout this month. Now we are currently at $880 out of our $5,000 goal, which is a bit slower than we would like at this stage of our fundraiser. So please do give generously before the fundraiser ends on April 15. All funds go towards the Pixel Project's work to help end violence against women. Now, let me add this slide, and here we go. Okay, so you can donate to get these goodies on RallyUp at tinyurl.com/R4P RallyUp IWD 2023. And this is case sensitive, so please be careful when you type. And if you want to learn more about Read for Pixels, you can go to bit.ly/read4pixels. Now, the Pixel Project's first charity anthology, Giving the Devil His Due, where the Twilight Zone meets Promising Young Woman, was a finalist in the 2021 Shirley Jackson Awards and is currently a finalist in the Audie Awards 2023. It is available in ebook, paperback, and audiobook editions. The ebook and paperback versions are available for order from major booksellers worldwide, including Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, Google Play, Book Depository, and other major booksellers worldwide. Additionally, we have teamed up with 12 of the 16 authors to offer an exclusive limited edition anthology bookplate for paperback buyers. Each author will sign 16 bookplates, and it'll be first come, first served. Each bookplate includes a resource for domestic violence and sexual assault victims and survivors in 205 countries. For more information about the anthology and how to score a bookplate, visit bit.ly/Given the Devil His Due. Now, and our audiobook version is now available from Audible, Apple, Google Play, Spotify, Kobo, Chirp, and other major audiobook retailers worldwide. Plus, as a bonus, for Women's History Month and International Women's Day this March, the audiobook is currently being offered for a special price of $8 until March 18th, next Sunday. So do go and get it quick. For more information about the audiobook, visit tinyurl.com/GTDHD audiobook R4P. All net proceeds go towards keeping the Pixel Project's campaigns, programs, and initiatives, such as this one, alive and kicking. Now, to find out more about violence against women and what you can do about it, visit the Pixel Project's website at www.thepixelproject.net. Now, Karen, I believe you have a couple of announcements for us.
There are a couple things I just want to share. One is that I have a newsletter that comes out every 6 weeks, and in it I always include an essay and a book giveaway by another woman author. That's just my way of supporting my other women writers in my community. And in exciting news, Under a Veiled Moon was actually nominated for both the Lefty and Agatha. So I will be at Left Coast Crime and Malice Domestic. If anyone is going to be there, I'd love to chat with you.
That's great. And we have come to the end of today's session. Thank you once again to Karen and to all of you who have been watching this session. Have a good day or a good night wherever you are in the world.
Thanks so much.